Government of Cuba says that it will release 553 prisoners, adding that the move is largely through the efforts of Pope Francis and his call for clemency in the 2025 Jubilee year. The Vatican calls the release, quote, a sign of great hope. Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin adds that it is important that Havana link the decision directly to the efforts of the Holy Father. Well, this comes just days after the Biden administration removed Cuba from the list of countries that are state sponsors of terror. The Vatican says that it supports the move, adding that it has worked with the White House to improve conditions in the island nation. The head of the Archdiocese of Miami, with a heavy Cuban population, says that he is optimistic the move is the right one. Archbishop Thomas Wensky says in part, quote, Cuba is on the verge of becoming a failed state and lacks the ability, quote, to represent a real threat to the U.S. The U.S. list of state sponsors of terror is now limited to Iran, North Korea, and Syria. And Archbishop Thomas Wensky from the Archdiocese of Miami joins us now. Your Excellency, thank you so much for your time today. I first would like to get your reaction to the release of the more than 500 prisoners from Cuba, largely through the efforts of Pope Francis.
Yes, well, it's a welcome thing, because the Church in Cuba has been advocating for a couple of years now for the release of these prisoners, and 500 represents about maybe 20% of those that were in prison after the spontaneous protests that erupted on the island in July of 2021. And so hopefully this is the first of many other releases to come.
Yeah, I want to talk now about removing Cuba from the states that sponsor terrorism list. What was the reaction of the faithful from Cuba in your archdiocese when they heard this news earlier? And what is your reaction?
Well, first of all, I think the release of the prisoners and the lifting of this sanction of designation of a terrorist state are probably connected together, and in that sense, it gave perhaps the Vatican some leverage to get these prisoners released. Now, that I've said this in Miami to many Cubans here already, that, you know, taking off a label or putting on a label doesn't really change the reality of what Cuba is. And we know what Cuba is, and we know its difficulties, and just the removing the designation or putting it back on doesn't change that reality, unfortunately. Yeah. So I think most people will react just, as it wasn't really earth-shaking in one way or the other. In one sense, if we were really thinking that Cuba was a terrorist threat to the United States, we would not have let close to 500 million Cubans into the country in the last 15 months. So, I think it's that in itself shows that, Cuba doesn't really threaten the United States. That doesn't mean that Cuba is not a bad actor in the region, but the Cubans coming to the United States represent no threat to the United States.
And I know that you've mentioned, Your Excellency, that Cuba is close to becoming a failed state. Talk to us more about that.
Well, we have, a whole constellation of failed states. I tell people in Miami that we're surrounded by islands of pain: Haiti, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and right now in Cuba, Cuba is undergoing one of the worst economic crises that it's had since the Soviet Union cut them off in the early 90s. Cuba lacks fuel, it lacks food, it lacks electricity, and it lacks people, because its youth are leaving the country in increasing numbers, leaving behind the elderly, and therefore making difficulties for schools to have adequate number of teachers teaching the children that are remaining, etc. So Cuba is in a very difficult situation, and unfortunately, the leaders of the Cuban government don't seem to have any vision to move forward towards a transition that would perhaps help for a soft landing as Cuba, transitions to another form of government or form of economy.
Well, Your Excellency, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate it. God bless.
God bless you.